Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Welcome to another virtual discussion of IFA. Thanks for logging on a time when you have FIFA fever and you have election fever and MCD fever. So many fevers are taking place. I think we have a discussion on a subject of very large public interest, and we couldn't have found a more eminent, more erudite, more knowledgeable and experienced panel than we have, headed by Ambassador Shamsaran. So I was saying that, look, there is hardly any post which he hasn't held. I mean, before he became Foreign Secretary, he was in Myanmar and Kathmandu and Indonesia, and then he was Prime Minister's envoy on climate change, and then on civil nuclear negotiations. Then after retirement, he has not retired actually. He has been chairman of RIS, chairman of National Security Advisory Board, then he's senior fellow CPR, now he's life trustee and president of the IIC. He has written many seminal books. I think two of his books are very relevant, and how India sees the world, and our most latest is how China sees India. I think this book has been very highly rated, and I see on the Google that many of civil servant aspirants, they are reading this book for preparing for their civil servant examination. Well, Shyam, he will have the last word. We have General Deepak Kapoor. He has been very kind enough for last so many years. He has shown the courtesy of participating in discussions in physical form as well as virtual form. Not only that, he was kind enough to contribute a very significant article last book, India 75, India Security and Defense Preparedness. And he's a highly decorative soldier. I mean, it's very difficult to remember all the decorations he has got. I found some days PBSM, ABSM, SM, BSM, ADC. He was the chief of 22nd Chief of the Army Staff and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs Staff Committee. So we are honored to have him here to give the very significant perspective on the PLA and what it's like to do. Same Professor Kondapalli, last time in talking about Nepal, I was saying that he takes PLA for breakfast and he takes CPP for lunch and Xi Jinping for dinner. In terms of intellectual pursuit, he has been following China for the last 40 years. He's Dean of the International Studies Department, JNU, and also Professor of Chinese Study. And I now realize that he has done a book. He's called this is a book, China's Military, then the PLA in Transition in China and her neighbors. So you are the right person to know the pulse of what is changes happening there. Now, we don't have Suhasini Heather here, but I think most of us know. I see here somebody else has joined. Welcome. Now, Suhasini, Lady Sri Ram College, then went to Boston University and she was CNN and UN and CNN Bureau in Delhi. Then for 9 years, he was CNN IBN, the main anchor and very popular host of the program called The Worldview, which made her almost a household name. And she has been to all the trouble spots in Iraq and Libya, Syria, Lebanon, Afghanistan, and Sri Lanka. And she has won quite a few awards. I didn't mention earlier, but she has won awards, Best Presenter in 2010 and Prem Bharti Award 2015 and IT Award Best Chat Show. And I was surprised when I was seeing the most protected person on the Google. They said no information about her date of birth, her religion, her weight, her height, her food habits. So I said, look, Google is protecting people, so not divulge any. Now, my own, since I'm no China expert, I haven't done Chinese language, I have not been posted to China, though I visited China. My only brush is the DS East Asia Division. I participated long back in 3 rounds of India-China border talks, headed by likes of Ambassador Eric Gonsalves and Ambassador K.S. Bajpai, and very formidable Joint Secretary called Ranjit Sethi, who was one of the most fluent Chinese-speaking diplomat which we have. And he had his own way. I remember in 3-round talk, he corrected the Chinese delegation, not in English, but corrected their Chinese language 4 times. And he saw to it the Chinese delegate accepted that his correction, what word he was suggesting was better word for China than he was using. So I have no clue. You all will enlighten. I personally feel that we have our own subjective view of China because they have done us so much harm. They continue occupying so much of our territory. They have killed Indians 62. Recently, we have LSE problem. Their relations with Pakistan and some part of India, which they have been ceded by Pakistan. And we have all kinds of problems which we have. But I personally, as a layman, feel that many of the commentators tend to vilify, demonize China and blame China for everything, and also try to downplay. Welcome, Swasini is very much here. And I had spoken about her a lot. I don't know whether she has heard that or not. Now, I would say that China may have many problems, but the tendency to write, I saw some articles in Times of India 10 days back, which talk about by Ruchir Sharma. He said China will continue to be number 2 in the world economy till 2060. Now, how on earth are you going to extrapolate for next 40 years? So which people have tendency to. Secondly, I personally feel the Sham will know better. The Chinese should not underestimate. Look, how it transformed. I used to in Hong Kong as a first secretary, I used to go to Canton Fair. That was a time when China did not have a single 5-star hotel owned city. They didn't have computers, bank, they didn't have any calculators. I remember in the American pavilion, they had a huge 3-meter tall bottle of Coca-Cola, glass bottle. And 3 days, a long queue of Chinese who went around seeing it because they have never seen Coca-Cola bottle. I'm talking 1979. But the Chinese people who came to see that bottle, they could buy a single bottle of Coca-Cola because that was more than the 1 week's wages of Chinese. So from that state where they've come a long way, I think we should hold our horse or not try to see that they are just gone and disappeared. Now, without further ado, I think we should really begin the program seriously. We have got all our panels here. So I will begin with the Professor Kondapalli, because you have been extensive following. Now, I had written to you some of the points, which I feel is that China had witnessed that. You have seen, let's start with the Congress, 20th Congress. We have seen all the spectacle, how the former president was taken out, escorted, whether he was frail or he was drunk or he was delivered, we don't know. And also we have seen Xi Jinping has got the 3rd term. He has been elevated, got his thoughts enshrined in constitution. Now he's on par with Chairman Mao. And do you think he has filled up President Committee with all his proceedings and whatever? Do you think the political opposition to Xi in China has been totally decimated? My first question. Second question is, China witnessed for nearly 30 years double-digit economy. It created a lot of billionaires. They have second number of billionaires in the world. Now, suddenly, when Chinese economy is declining, I was told by Sujit Bhalla, IMF, that China might come down to 1.5% growth next year. If that happens, do you think the people at large in China and the tycoons who have been clipped like Jack Ma will continue to support this government? The third question is that China's population policy has failed. We will take over from China population next year. Now, this decline in population will have long-term impact on China economy in coming years. And this COVID started from Wuhan. And now, surprising, ironically, when the whole world over, this COVID infection is ebbing. In China, it's surging. You have seen they are talking about 31,000, 34,000 infections. Now, their protests and there are all kind of, Do you think these protests are widespread? How serious they are? So I'm leaving to you. You jumble all the questions, whichever order, whatever way, but you remember that you have only 10 minutes to do justice to all this. Thank you. Unmute yourself. Unmute. Yes.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Kumar. And let me also greet the fellow panelists and participants in this discussion. Namaskar. The first issue on the 20th Party Congress, whether Xi Jinping is unassailable. To a large extent, it appears the scenarios indicate to his unassailability. When we look at the Politburo Standing Committee composition, Politburo and Central Committee as well. So for the next 5 years, when you look at just the numbers, leave alone the informal politics, factional struggles, and others. When we look at the numbers indicate that Xi Jinping is in an unassailable position. When we look at the Standing Committee, all the 7 are proteges of Xi Jinping, except Zhao Leqi and Wang Huning, who also worked under Hu Jintao before. And so there is a kind of divided loyalty, but it's too strong a word to say that. So this is one aspect. When we look at Xi Jinping, Li Qiang's the possible premier now in March next year, replacing Li Keqiang. Li Qiang is at the Shanghai Party Secretary, and he learned in the Polytechnic University in Hong Kong. They suggest that he had some guidance from Li Ka-shing, the Hong Kong tycoon, in many of these, but he doesn't have a strategic economic policy in place, which is linked to whether, as Dr. Balla had mentioned, about 1.5% growth rate or beyond in terms of becoming #1 economy. In these areas, Li Qiang is not a suitable candidate in the sense of not having a strategic economic policy. So Li Qiang, but also he is kind of close to the big businesses, which is what Shanghai faction has been for the past 4 decades. And so Li Qiang has also the backing of the big business, which of course suffered a little bit with the common prosperity drive and also the restrictions on the Alibaba chief, Jack Ma, and others. Tencent, Meituan, and other companies are also relatively down when we look at their prospects in the Hang Seng Index in Hong Kong. The third in command, Zhao Leqi, served before, and he kept the Xi Jinping's home province, Shanxi, intact. He is from Qinghai, from Amdo province of Tibet, and that is interesting to look at the Tibet factor as well. Wang Huning is the ideologue from Jiang Zemin's 3 represents to Hu Jintao's harmonious world, scientific development, and Xi Jinping's the China dream, China rejuvenation, and all that stuff, socialism with Chinese characteristics under the new era, and a host of other things. Cai Qi, Ting Xuexiang, and Li Xi. Cai Qi is a Beijing party secretary, Ting Xuexiang, the general office of the Central Committee. You may have seen in the videos on Hu Jintao being lifted outside the hall. The one works with Ting Xuexiang in the Central Committee, but also seen extensively during Xi Jinping's foreign visits, and suggests that there is Ting Xuexiang's hand in getting the Communist Youth League faction of Hu Jintao almost out in this 20th Party Congress. So that suggests to his unassailability. However, As I mentioned, the Central Committee still has a lot of Communist Youth League leaders as well as Jiang Zemin's factional leaders. So there is the problem there. During the last tenure in the 19th Party Congress and after, Xi Jinping had introduced a few legal procedures, which included that anyone who wants to raise an issue in the Central Committee proceedings, they need to take permission from Xi Jinping, the General Secretary of the party, to raise such questions. Second is his amendment in the NPC, National People's Congress, to dismiss any vice premier. And that also provides for a lot of powers for Xi Jinping in this regard. So I would suggest that the unassailability is for the short term, before the factional struggles keep catching up with the Communist Party dynamics. Let me clarify here, while the Communist Party says it doesn't have any factions, in reality, there is the Shanghai Gang, the Tsinghua Graduates, the Communist Youth League, the PLA Princelings, New Zhejiang Army, where Zhejiang province, where Xi Jinping worked as a party secretary in 2000s. So that is where Li Jiang and other proteges of Xi Jinping have come into the Politburo Standing Committee members. But let me clarify here that none of these
Professor, you have to cover 3 other points also. Otherwise, we'll go to the Congress. Okay.
I would only say that there is only tactical differences in all these factions, but strategic unity as far as reform, the domestic consumption, the dual circulation strategy, or Made in China 2025, which is linked to the economic growth and other aspects, the second aspect. World Bank suggested 2.4%. The official Chinese estimate is about 3.6%. The official estimate was not publicized till the party congress is over. They were supposed to come out roughly on the October 20th, but that has not come about. So in any case, even if China grows at 1.5% or 1.6%, as Dr. Balla had suggested, they are adding $300-400 billion to the already $17 trillion economy. So there is a huge, foundation that is there in this. And of course, there is also the outreach programs like the Belt and Road, which a third summit meeting is due next year, which Xi Jinping cited that he would be able to conduct one next year. Common prosperity is one area where there is a lot of thrust in China. This is also to finance some of the poverty alleviation programs. So it looks like this is going to be a flagship program. On whether China can become democratic in nature, not for the short to medium term. In the near future, there is no prospect, but the Central Party School had a project. Brantley OMAC had done this project for the Central Party School to look at the modernization and to look at the decentralization of power structures without compromising on Deng Xiaoping's 4 cardinal principles, with Communist Party as supreme in the leading positions. In fact, Xi Jinping also stated these and reflected in the 20th Party Congress work report. But nevertheless, there is this model that Central Party School has been suggesting to, number one, village level elections, which are being conducted regularly. I witnessed the village elections in China. These are relatively free and fair, except that the Sarpanch is a Communist Party member, invariably. And so there is no guesses in that. But a lot of rich people are getting elected in the village level elections.
Now
but
come to population, non-population, please.
Yeah, but Communist Party is not located at the village level. It is located at the county level, prefecture level, provincial level, central level. And so there is no threat for the Communist Party from such democratization, village level democratization. On COVID-19, 28,000 to 33,000. Yesterday, it was about 33,000 cases. It gives an opportunity for China to clamp down on any dissent, many areas are suddenly locked down. And my students report back from China that there is a lot of restrictions and many want to get away, but they cannot get away with the border controls. So this could also be not just COVID-19 related thing, but also to control social behavior, political unrest, given the decline. Because the Hong Kong economist suggested there are already 80 million unemployed in China today with the COVID-19 lockdowns, and 18% unemployment rate this year, despite so much of economic and other allocations that were suggested. So the manufacturing index is declined below 48, which means that there is the depressed growth rate in China. And COVID also adds to this because of the lockdowns and so on and so forth. Finally, on the population policy, I'm sorry, I'm being on population policy, the relaxation in Shanghai and other cities on more than a child has not really attracted the attention. 88% of the young people who were asked to express opinion on this said they wish to go ahead with the one-child policy rather than multiple children, so more than one child. So the one-child policy still is intact, although it has been relaxed substantially. And this is also creating a lot of issues in the society. In addition to lying flag generation, which do not want to work and want to just take the life easily in this regard. Will that result in will India's population increase result in any kind of competition? We still have a lot of window of opportunity here because average age of Indians are 26 years old and China is 36 years old. So there is, and 65% of the population in China would be about roughly 45 to 60 years. And so this is a demographic challenge that China is unable to fix.
Professor, I think we should move on now. Thank you very much. Now, the others, now I will turn to General Kapoor, starting from the same 20th Congress. You saw one of the deputy commander or some senior PLA person was felicitated at the Congress, which seemed to many persons in India very insensitive to put him there. And keep in mind the fact that though the commander level talks have taken place, I think 18 or 19 times, except for Hot Spring, Gogra, then not much really has happened. So how do you see the situation on LAC when emboldened, stronger Xi Jinping will be willing to have some kind of a more responsible and accommodating sort of attitude, or they'll give free hand to PLA to teach India a lesson in much bigger scale than what happened in Galwan Valley? And second question, as you know, China has been very extensively trying to build their navy. They want to make it the mightiest navy in the world. Do you think in coming years, India will have to prepare to fight with China, take on China on the land as well as in the naval space? China has been getting all these bases outside, whether Habantota or Guadalajara or maybe Djibouti. How are we lagging behind in this field? And lastly, what is the best way, according to you, to deal with China in military sense? Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Kumar, and good evening to all the panelists and participants. Let me begin by saying that it is unusual to give a third term to a sitting president, which has been done by the 20th Congress. And that having been done, and keeping in mind the policies that Xi Jinping has followed in the past, I expect that he would be keen and eager to show results. As it is the policy of hiding your capabilities and biding your time has gone into the background. We see a more aggressive and a more expansionist China coming on the regional as well as the global stage. If that is so, the expansion can happen towards the Taiwan area, towards Indo-Pacific and the South China Sea. And last but not the least, the Himalayas. If we look at all these, you would find that both Indo-Pacific as well as South China Sea, the number of people affected and therefore the support which the West would provide to all these is going to be tremendous. Therefore, the Chinese are expected to face a lot of opposition. Now, of all these areas of expansionism, one would find that in case of Himalayas, possibly it becomes a comparatively, and I would say comparatively, a low-hanging fruit. To that extent, we've seen in the last couple of years, there have been constant efforts at salami slicing, a policy of what is mine I keep and what is yours is negotiable. If one keeps that in mind, I would, and finally also that Xi Jinping must show some results in an area of a rising China with a declining economy, as well as the fact that productivity has gone down, the growth has gone down. So where would he like to show results? If that be so, I do expect a certain amount of turbulence along the LAC, which is approximately 3,488 kilometers long, starting from East Ladakh all the way up to Arunachal Pradesh. And this, considering this kind of salami slicing, I think we should be prepared not only in East Ladakh, but also in Arunachal Pradesh, where a number of claims have been made by them. And if one has read today's Hindustan Times, they've come out with certain combined armed brigades additionally being placed, about 4 of them, in different areas, starting in the area of Sikkim, in the area of Tawang, and opposite the area of Balong, etc. So it only goes to show that the possibility of, I wouldn't say a full-fledged war, but the possibility of a limited conflict goes up. And we also look at the threat that India has on its borders from our Western neighbor, with the changes which are happening now in terms of the chief of the army staff, the new chief taking over, who is likely to be a little more hardline than his predecessor. So I think the possibility of greater turbulence all along the Sino-Indian border is going to be greater. So we have to also keep in mind the fact that the Chinese over a period of time have developed an excellent infrastructure, both logistically and otherwise, to be prepared for such an eventuality. Therefore, as the military, we need to be careful. Coming now towards the Indian Ocean region, we are also aware various ports, etc., and countries where the Chinese are showing tremendous interest to be able to dominate the Indian Ocean region, specifically Kyaukphyu in Myanmar, Chittagong in Bangladesh, Hambantota in Sri Lanka, Gwadar in Pakistan, and we already know that they have a base at Djibouti as well. So the attempt to try and reach into these areas specifically clear, and if that be so, that is another area of concern when we look at an overall picture of this region. The third aspect is the aspect of strategic autonomy that India has, that policy which India has always followed. Now, if that is the policy which is followed, therefore India is more interested in ensuring that its national interest is looked after and taken care of. Therefore, it has not joined any blocs, even though it may be part of a Quad arrangement. It may be, shall we say, inclining a little more towards the West, but it therefore places India in an independent situation, therefore perhaps easier to tackle than others like Japan or South Korea, which are much more closely aligned to the West and to the US. So that is something, again, that's an aspect we need to look into. So therefore, that brings me to the next issue as to how is India to tackle such a situation. We are also aware that the Chinese have been spending approximately 3.5 to 4 times the Indian military budget for the last 20 to 25 years on their military. And they have created bases, airfields, all-weather airfields in the entire length of the line of actual control. So therefore, the first thing I think that's required that we need to look into is to increase the defense budget to be prepared for meeting this kind of a two-front threat that we have. And it is pointed out that the current budget as of today stands at approximately 1.47% of the GDP, while most analysts and defense experts have been talking of increasing it and the requirement of taking it to gradually to approximately 3% of the GDP. The second requirement, which is also equally important, is that of development of infrastructure. I'm happy to state that currently in the last 4 to 5 years, the attempt to increase and improve the infrastructure in the border area and all along the line of actual control has gone up. But we are still way behind if we compare ourselves to the Chinese side, specifically in the Tibet areas. We need to put in a lot more effort. We need to have at least alternate axes available to be able to sustain the forces that we deploy to meet a threat. Unfortunately, in all these areas, in some of these areas, I would say, we do not have too many options. Therefore, it limits us. The fourth aspect that I like to talk about is the fact that Chinese have, by and large, respected firm response. And how we've been able to stall them in East Ladakh, specifically north of Pangong Tso, was by our action when we went ahead and occupied the Kailash range, which brought them to the negotiating table to be able to indulge in give and take and therefore bring about a certain amount of order in the area north of Pangong Tso. Similar aspects need to be looked at from the military perspective to see how best we can take advantage of areas where we have a tactically strong position to be able to ensure that the aggressors are not able to get away with salami slices in the long run. So it is something which is going to take a bit of time, and it's something which will not happen overnight, but we need to start working on it. And that is the only way we will be able to tackle expansionism as far as the Chinese in the Himalayan region are concerned. Thank you very much.
Thank you, General. You have been like typical general, very precise and crisp and to the point. I appreciate that. I turned to Ms. Swasini Haida. Before you came, I referred to your 9 years as one of the most popular anchor on your worldview program. So let us start from there and give us some crystal ball gazing about what happened at G20. Now, the 3-hour-long physical meeting between Biden and Xi Jinping, it might not be termed a breakthrough, but I think this can really have some hints of thought. And I would like to know your views. What do you think? Secondly, we didn't have any bilateral meeting between our Prime Minister Modi and Chinese president. but they did shake hands. And a lot of speculation. If you go to some Hindi television channels where the body language was saying what, there were no jadoo ki jhappi, but there was some smiles and all that. But I'm sure we want to manage our relations. I think our friend Sabar Sawal has used that word, managing relations with Pakistan, but I think that's something that is what we have to do the same, managing so that no precipitation of the crisis we have seen at LAC, and we have tranquility and peace for more than 40 years. So how do we manage that? And I'm sure we want Xi Jinping to visit India next year for our G20 summit. And last is that you have seen Quad, Indo-Pacific, AUKUS, all the South route, we are not against you, but fact that China think these are all aimed against her. And no matter how many clarifications we are given, they are not convinced, they are not met. I think Russians also share their perception. And we have seen that the US, Europe, they keep on advising the ASEAN, how these countries try to flag how assertive, aggressive China is and how big a threat China is. But if you go by the recent summit of ASEAN and APEC, I didn't see any notice that these countries really want to distance themselves from China. Over to you.
Thank you so much for your kind words and for being so patient with me being delayed on my return. So I apologize for that. I'll try and pick up from what the speakers before me have already said. And you're absolutely right that the meeting at Bali between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi, at first glance, it may seem just like two leaders exchanging cordialities, though when you look at the context, it certainly is not absolutely, expected. I say this because 2 months ago, I was in Samarkand for the SCO summit. And we saw that the two leaders, at least right at the beginning when the photo call was done, did not even exchange glances. They stood literally shoulder to shoulder, but didn't exchange any glances while they were there. Clearly, there were some reports at the time that the two leaders had met subsequently at a lunch engagement, which were never confirmed by the government. But seeing the body language or seeing the fact that Prime Minister Modi stood up from his table, turned around, shook hands with President Xi, it would seem likely that something happened between that very awkward photo call and this photo op moment. Obviously, it was a dinner banquet. I don't think either leader were expecting to be on camera, and that too, this telephoto lens that seems to have captured more than the officials themselves told me they had expected would go out. But I wouldn't like to make too much of what is essentially, at the end of the day, was this kind of exchanging of cordialities between the two leaders. But the question is larger, and you raised all these various parts of the relationship. The question is larger. Why does India still feel so hamstrung that despite all that has happened over the last 3 years, that Prime Minister Modi still is making that effort? One of the points you made was that we do hope to have the leadership in the Chinese leadership in India for the G20. There's also an SCO summit that India will be hosting, and of course there'll also be a Pakistani leader who will be invited for that. But I wanted to very quickly go through, and because I know you are tight on time, I just wanted to go through 5 areas where I think we need to think about how India's options when it comes to dealing with China are constrained. The first is that despite all that has happened, India-China ties remain interlinked. It's not just the 3,500 kilometer LAC. The fact is that trade has not diversified as much as perhaps the government would have wanted. Just in this year, we crossed $103 billion in bilateral trade by September. That was a leap of 15% over last year, which was already a leap of about 30% over the previous year when it comes to China-India bilateral trade. So supply chains are still linked. The second part of that is that India's continental challenges keep its resources tied. And what do I mean by saying this? I think General Deepak Kapoor referred to it slightly, but as long as the situation at the LAC constrains India's resources, particularly military resources, our attention. And there is the possibility always of that two fronts that India has to contend with. It makes it that much more difficult for India to move away and to diversify in its other resource areas, for example, the maritime sphere and other places it wants to diversify. So it is necessary in some way to contain this challenge. And I think Prime Minister Modi's handshake was a handshake of pragmatism and of an acceptance of that reality. I think that acceptance also came just after the Chinese Congress, indicating that India or our establishment certainly feels that for the foreseeable future, this is what they are going to be dealing with. This is the scenario. This is where China is headed. I think the second part that constrains us is the US-China relationship. It's often called a triangle because it is so interlinked. India's relations with China get closer, the US gets more interested, India's relations with the US gets closer, China gets more insecure. But when the US and China get closer, India does have a problem because it inevitably in the past has led to the scenario where the US kind of leaves China to its sphere of influence, which China believes includes India, and of course it doesn't. So at the meeting between President Biden and President Xi, you quite rightly pointed out, 3 hours, even if you consider translation time and all the rest, is quite a lot. The Secretary of State will now travel to Beijing to take those talks forward. And it remains to be seen how far they can go. I think the US has made it clear they will continue to compete where they need to, confront where they have to, and cooperate where they can. India's only option then remains to keep this kind of strange balance that we have. People forget that the year we rejoined or revived the Quad in 2017 was also the year India joined the SCO. And it continues to do a kind of geopolitical balancing when it comes to its relations with the Western alliances and it comes to its relationship with alliances that include China, SCO, BRICS, RIC, and all the rest. The second is the rest of the world. So if the US, you asked about Europe, I think what we are seeing from Europe is a lot of caution when it comes to China, but not decoupling. And the real contrast for Europe is while principles and political differences with Russia are right at the top, they don't see a possibility of dealing with Russia anymore. With China, they're talking about pragmatism, about maybe just diversifying 10% of their business and their supply chains, which are so heavily entrenched in China. There's another part to this, and this is the Ukraine war. If Europe's trade really depended on two things, two pillars. They used to say cheap energy from Russia and a big market in China. You're now looking at a situation where at least one has gone away for sure, and the other is a little, constrained because of COVID. So I can see that Europe is not trying to completely decouple from China over there. The next point, which is the fourth one, is the Russian equation. Ties with China, between Beijing and Moscow have clearly become more and more interdependent, and certainly with Moscow being more dependent. This is not something that's new. This has been happening for a while, especially after 2014 and the Russian actions in Crimea. We saw the signing of the $300 billion pipeline. We saw the openings up between the two, which really is something India has to try and seek a counterbalance on. Because if it was to take on Russia and China together, India's neighborhood would become extremely hard. There is no part of this region now, if you look to the West, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Central Asia, Iran, and on the other side to China, there is no part that is not then going to be part of a tough neighborhood for India. And the fifth reason, and this is something I see less analysis on, I would like to see more because I am not a China scholar, and I'd like to see more written, is something that even External Affairs Minister Jaishankar has often commented on. I mean, he said, essentially, we don't know why China did what they did in April 2020. Now, at the time, it could have been something that we had to just deal with. and then Galwan happened, and then a lot of measures went into place just to take the tensions down between the two countries. But nearly 3 years later, we have no excuse to not understand why China did this. There are different reasons, many will give. Of course, the idea that this was a local skirmish that just became much bigger, I think now that has been done away with. It seems to have been on April 18th, a very considered move by the PLA, and a move that was then given sanction, if not before, certainly after the amassing of troops along the LAC, the incursions at 5 different parts of the LAC as well. So if it is not local issues, what is it? Is it China's basic hegemonistic move? We've seen it in South China Sea, we've seen it in Taiwan. Are we also seeing it in what was famously called the 5 fingers that Mao spoke about, and that this is just part of China reclaiming or trying to put a claim on territory it considered its? Of course, this is Tibetan territory it's talking about, so it wasn't China's territory to start with, but is that the reason? The next possible reason is a desire to stop, why the PLA amassed where they did, was the desire to stop Indian construction of infrastructure at certain places that could have affected or could have given vantage points to Chinese construction, to Chinese infrastructure, particularly the Karakoram 2 highway that they're thinking of, also of other ways of connecting to the BRI and the CPEC. That remains an open question. And the 5th is really, was it about India's own stated ambitions? That while all the 4 things I spoke about earlier may be true, was it also that the timing came from the idea that the Modi government, fresh from its victory in 2019, fresh from having conducted an Uri encounter, what was it called, a surgical strike in 2016, and found the world really supporting India, fresh from 2019 and the Balakot strikes, where India launched missiles into Pakistan. Whether it was also from that electoral victory that followed that we saw the Article 370 move take place. It was interesting at the time of Article 370 that China put out not 1 but 2 separate statements. One, which was about Jammu Kashmir, don't change the status quo, look at international agreements on this, human rights and all of that. But the more tough language, if you ask me, came in the Chinese reaction to the bifurcation of Jammu Kashmir and hiving off of Ladakh. And there we saw a very tough statement. Subsequently, when Home Minister Amit Shah in Parliament said that we will be taking back both POK and Aksai Chin, were the Chinese the only ones to take him at his word? And that's another question that does get asked. So I think these are the 5 factors I feel still continue to complicate our understanding of how it will go, how relations will go forward in the future. I think there is no doubt that compared to our decision to just cut off all ties with Pakistan, and then Pakistan's subsequent decisions to do the same, are very different from the way we have dealt with China. The talks that have continued, military talks have continued, WMCC talks have continued, External Affairs Minister Jaishankar has met his counterparts, Defense Minister has met his counterparts, the NSA has met his counterpart. I think there is a big difference. There's a huge difference between the way the government treated those who died in the Pulwama attacks, where each body was accompanied by a senior officer, a senior official or a minister to the funerals. Compare it with the way the Galwan, the martyrs of Galwan were kind of, it was not played up politically in quite the same way. I think that pragmatism has shown everything we need to know about how India is planning to deal with this. But I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much for a very energetic presentation. You are a China expert in your own right. Now we turn to our friend, expert, guru, Shyam Saran. You wrote a book called How India Sees the World from Kautilya to 21st Century. So like Kautilya, you have been taking note or listening to all the people. So Asani has thrown so many questions. I had some questions, but I will leave them, I think, only relate to one. Our EM has been very frank, openly stated so many times. India-China relations are witnessing one of the roughest, difficult phase. And also he put forward some 7 commandments, how to normalize relations, whether China will really take note of those and how far they will come through, I don't know. So you are free, sir, to comment to all other speakers have said. Also try to comment on how badly are the damage by denial of the semiconductors by the US, European to China. And lastly, this whole idea of this again coming back to after 3 years, we have been discussing what China did and why it did in Galwan. It's like if Raghuraj Raman can say title book is I Do What I Do. Now Chinese can't say we do what we do. I'm sure they have serious reasons today. Over to you. Unmute. Yeah.
Thank you, Surendra. Thank you for inviting me to another FIFA session, and I listened with great interest to all the very valuable interventions made by my fellow panelists, and I will try and focus my remarks on issues which may perhaps have not been covered so far. So let me begin by talking about what is my reading of the 20th Party Congress and how I see that impacting on how this affects the foreign relations aspect of China, and in that context, what does it mean for India as well? So one of the first things that I find with regard to the 20th Party Congress, we have already heard how Xi Jinping has consolidated his position. Something unprecedented has happened, that he has become party secretary for the third time, that he has packed the Politburo and the standing committee with those who are his loyalists and are part and parcel of his particular faction, and then this gives him considerable amount of expanded power to do what he wishes to do. Now, just to make a couple of maybe add a couple of riders to that. One is that some recent reports that we are looking at, I saw a very interesting article from the Nikkei, the Japanese newspaper, which said that there was a move at the party congress to incorporate in the party constitution the term people's leader for Xi Jinping, that is Renmin Lingxiu, that is people's leader. But it appears now that this particular formulation was resisted and it was not included in the party constitution. So a bit of a pushback against Xi Jinping's attempt to sort of elevate himself to Mao-like status. The second is there is a phrase called the two establishments, which basically talks about the supremacy of the party, and also in that context the undisputed role of Xi Jinping as the party secretary. So both these, the two establishments were also, there was a considerable amount of before the Congress focus on this. But it also now appears that that effort to try and put that also into the party constitution was resisted. So the point I'm making is that perhaps even though Xi Jinping has acquired even greater power than before, perhaps this is not quite unqualified. That we have seen a certain degree of pushback and resistance to that, and that is something which we need to watch for the future. Second point is that if we look at what are the outcomes of the 20th Party Congress, one, there is clearly no doubt that there is a shift towards a more ideological stance on various issues facing China. So this reflects, for example, in stressing that the old distinction between red and expert. If at Deng Xiaoping's time, there was a shift towards more expert and less emphasis on red, then now the emphasis is beginning to shift back to red. So you see time and again a reference to the fact that it's extremely important that we appoint people who have loyalty to the party and loyalty to the leader. So this has become an important criteria for the personnel policy. Secondly, we see a greater stress on the role of the state-owned enterprises. Again, something which we had seen receding in the past, particularly after Deng Xiaoping initiated the reforms. Now the state-owned enterprises, according to President Xi Jinping, if you look at his speech, is that he says that the future will see technology as the new battlefield. That is going to determine the power of nations and where they will stand in terms of their geopolitical position. And that in that respect, it is very important for China to try and achieve relative technological self-reliance, and which this answers your point about the semiconductors, and that in leading this technological transformation of China and its progress towards relative technological self-reliance, the champions will be the state-owned enterprises. Again, this is very important because actually for the last 40 years, the leaders, the drivers of China's economic, accelerated economic development have been the private sector, not the state-owned enterprises. In fact, when China joined the WTO, the state-owned enterprises, many of them were closed. Large numbers of employees of the state-owned enterprises actually became unemployed. And much more space was created for the private sector. And that is how large multinational companies like Alibaba or Baidu or Weibo, these are the large companies which emerge. Now they are in decline. Now they are being pushed back. And reason why they are being targeted in a sense is that there is a sense that having become very, very large and rich companies, they had begun to influence the party as well. Many of them had very close relations with important party leaders. Bit of crony capitalism was also the case then. So there has been attack against them. So going forward, the focus is going to be really on the state-owned enterprises. So this is another important shift that we see taking place. The third important element is that despite the fact that, for example, the COVID-19 challenge, early phase, of course, China said we have been able to conquer the COVID, and this reflects the superiority of the Chinese system and the great leadership qualities of Xi Jinping. Now, of course, they are in a somewhat different position. But because of the fact that that policy, zero COVID policy, was associated with the leadership of Xi Jinping, to try and change that now is like saying, well, that policy was not quite a very, very, sagacious policy on the part of Xi Jinping. So that is being resisted, despite the fact that it is leading to many serious disruptions in China's economic activities, particularly in major cities like Guangzhou and Shanghai. And while these were seen as temporary disruptions, they are becoming somewhat more extended, and the impact could be longer term than we thought perhaps in the beginning. So 2 or 3 points, therefore. There is a certain ideological turn towards the left, one. Number two, that there is perhaps not such undisputed leadership and power of Xi Jinping as we may have thought before. And number three, much more challenging economic situation, and an economic situation which is sought to be dealt with by this more ideologically oriented economic policy. So that is one set of points that I wanted to make. Second is, what does this mean in terms of China's foreign policy? So that I will look at what happened, for example, at the G20 and what happened then subsequently at the APEC meeting, because both these are important. And if you see G20 meeting, I was very interested in the readout given by, for example, the White House on the meeting which took place, very important meeting between Biden and Xi Jinping. There was only a one-page readout given by the Americans. But on the Chinese side, there is something like 4 to 5 pages of what happened at the meeting. So in that gives me a sense that the Chinese were really trying to put across, in a sense, in a somewhat defensive manner, what their position was. 2 or 3 differences. One, that, with respect to the Ukraine war, while the White House statement highlighted the fact that both Xi Jinping and Biden agreed that nuclear weapons must never be used, that a nuclear war must never be fought because it can never be won. This was omitted completely in the Chinese readout. Although I would have thought that in the reference to Ukraine, perhaps this would be included. The other part is, again, a somewhat defensive position on Ukraine itself, saying that, China has always been in favor of a peaceful settlement, and we would hope that Ukraine and Russia will talk to each other, and that, Washington and the European capitals will also talk to Russia, but not really saying anything about what China's position is with regard to this war. On Taiwan, very explicit, very categorical statement of China's position, very hard sort of projection of China's position, really saying this is the core of the core interests of China. So this is raising it one level more than what it was before. So it's not just a core interest, but it is the core of core interests. And that this is a red line which must never be crossed. So I think there was a effort to try and really convey to the American side the great sensitivity of this issue for China. So that is the second point. The third point which struck me was that Biden talked about we will compete. We will be, in a sense, rivals, but on certain global issues like, say, climate change or global health, we must cooperate together. So he very clearly laid out what are the areas we can work together. The other areas we should only try and ensure that we don't end up, fighting each other. On the Chinese side, however, it is somewhat different. He is trying to argue that actually, we should not be engaged in this kind of a very destructive competition. And he talks about something which they had said before, but had not been repeated for quite some time, is that China is not trying to change the existing international order. And secondly, more importantly, is not trying to displace the United States as the leader of this international order. Now, that is something, even though it is rhetorical, but that is somewhat of a change from really saying, the world situation has changed, a balance of power has changed irretrievably, that, this is our moment, and that, the West is in terminal decline. This seems to be a somewhat different kind of a projection. So this also is worth noting. So what I see is a Chinese attempt to re-engage with the world. So Xi Jinping was very active, meeting not only Biden, but several other leaders, not of course the Indian leader. Also, he carried forward that engagement also with the APEC meeting and meeting several of the Southeast Asian leaders, projecting a much more reasonable, much more sort of cordial kind of a approach. So we see that there was a charm offensive in a sense, both at G20 as well as at Southeast Asia. What does this mean for India? Well, The good news is that, in a sense, the kind of competition between US and China still gives us room of maneuver, and that is good. Secondly, the economic situation as it is unfolding in China, not only the property crisis, but the fact that, there is, you have mentioned also the population decline that is taking place, aging of the population. All these are now putting China in a phase where there will be much slower growth than before. I do not think that China is going to go back ever to 6%, 7% rate of growth. I think that particular phase is over. So China, like many other mature economies, is probably going to now grow at the rate of maybe 2.5 to 3% over a longer period of time. Now, if during this particular period of slowdown of China, if India, on the other hand, begins to then grow at the rate of 7 to 8% per annum, shrinking the power gap between the two countries, of course, this will expand our diplomatic space. On the economic side also, if India is able to get its act together and really open up its economy, then a lot of the shift that is taking place away from China, because of those disruptions that I talked about. You must have seen, for example, reports of what happened at the Apple factory in China. There was a labor strike. There was even violence there because of the COVID restrictions. So more and more countries which have very major economic assets in China are at least looking for, if not moving away from China, they want at least something which is a kind of a fallback. A China plus one kind of a approach. So that is also something that can be benefit India. But these are all potential, as I said, but I'm trying to convey that this is perhaps a more favorable moment for India geopolitically than has been the case for quite some time. Will this, therefore, my last point, is it going to change China's posture with respect to India? Now, here you have mentioned what Jaishankar said about China-India relations being in perhaps the most difficult phase. Given the kind of situation we are looking at, I suspect that this difficult phase is going to continue. I do not see that this is going to change in a hurry, but the two sides will maintain the kind of relationship that they have had at a somewhat reduced level, maintain their dialogue through, for example, the forum of the commanders of the two countries. But I do not see that there is going to be a major shift in China's posture towards India. One thing which I would like to finally mention, because this could become important, what I see, for example, in the attitude of, say, Japan, attitude of some of the Southeast Asian countries. I have seen some of the statements made by, there was a trilateral commission meeting in Japan recently, and I was quite struck by the fact that there were very strong statements made by some of the participants, the Japanese participants, Korean, as well as Southeast Asian countries, essentially criticizing the United States of America for taking on a very hardline posture towards China, and saying that this kind of polarization is something which is creating great, challenges for them. And one of the Southeast Asian countries representative even said that the US is trying to push us into making a choice. If it came to that, our interests with China are much more than our interests with the US, and we might be forced to choose China. And this was not to the same extent, but pretty close to that, also repeated by the Japanese, saying that we have such extensive economic interests in China that it is very difficult for us to see a situation where we might have to actually, retire from this relationship. So China may be in a somewhat more difficult situation today, but I think we should be careful not to think that somehow China is now going to become a sort of a passive power, or that the world is really opening up out for us. Many more equities still China enjoys. And I think any expectation that this power will somehow, no longer exercise very major influence, not only in Asia, but in the world, I think that is premature. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Shyam. Thank you for very elaborate comments. Now, all of you can take 2 minutes each for concluding remarks. Only I would like to add this limitation of country to limit their economic relations with China. Swasini has mentioned also, everybody knows that from Trump's time, all the tariff war till Biden time, the import of US from China have not gone down. We banned more than 3,000 Chinese applications. We have scrutinizing differently Chinese proposals project, but what is the result? We are importing more from China last year also. Before that, recently 2 months back, Railways had placed order for 500 crore rupees. This is Apple, India is also. So there are limitations. Now we will go through the same route again. Professor Kondapalli, General Kapoor, then Swasini, and back to Shyam, 2 minutes each, then we will close. Over to you, Professor Kondapalli. Are you still there? I can see his photo. Yes. Closing remarks, but only 2 minutes.
Yeah, well, I will just focus on the impact on India of the recent development
Okay.
In China, especially the 20th Party Congress.
Mm.
Xi Jinping's work report mentions about safeguarding China's dignity and core interests. So that, please remember, in the 18th Party Congress, a similar thing was mentioned, and we had the Chumar incident, Doklam incident, and later on the Galwan incident. So it is likely that the LAC still will be militarized for the short-term period, despite all the initiatives, including the core commander level meetings and so on. The participation of Chief Apao at the 20th Party Congress, who was involved in the Galwan, it indicates to reproducing those images of the Galwan and legitimacy provided for the Galwan-related skirmishes. The third is in terms of use of force and enhancing deterrence capabilities. The fourth is because of zero COVID, there are border controls, and we also have a lot of problem in terms of the student movements. There are 30,000 students, and while after Wang Yi's visit in March, this has been relaxed, but yet they found 6 lakh rupees airfare, and if you are paying 15 lakhs for the medical sciences admission and 6 lakhs for just going there, that is going to be pretty hard on the families of those who have been studying in the Tianjin and Guangzhou medical universities. A fifth impact is in terms of S&T and innovation that Xi Jinping emphasized in the work report. And so while that is related to competition with the US, we are also going to have some spillover effect on the, finally, Wang Yi's position in Politburo and He Weitung, General He Weitung in the Politburo. This suggests that General He Weitung was there when Doklam incident happened in the Western Theater Command, although his main focus is on the Eastern Theater Command, which means main focus on Taiwan. Yet we could probably see stiffening of position on LAC with India. Wang Yi has been relatively hard on India. He just visited Islamabad in March and proposed the Kashmir resolution there. So it looks like, despite all that we have seen, this is going to be the new normal in India-China relations. Thank you.
Okay, over to you, General Kapoor. 2 minutes. Please unmute yourself. Yes.
Just like to put across, Ambassador Kumar, that while the Chinese economy may not be in a very good state, the fact that it is expanding or want to indulge in expansionism is not in doubt. And at the regional level, and perhaps at some time in the future at the global level, China is continuing to go to see India as a competitor. And if that is so, it has to ensure that the economic activity of India does not grow at a pace at which its own has grown over the past couple of decades, and to keep India in check. Therefore, the possibility of keeping India at a little bit of imbalance is definitely not ruled out, because the resources that we have to divert to ensure territorial integrity would impinge on our developmental activities and economic growth. To that extent, also the fact that if Xi Jinping has to show any success compared to Japan, Korea, Taiwan, South China Sea, perhaps comparatively speaking, it would seem that India is a little low-hanging fruit if any success has to be shown by the president to his domestic audience. Keeping that in mind, the threat must not be wished away. It is likely to continue and can grow in future. Slicing may continue, and the ability to grab as much as possible may also continue. So,
Thank you.
therefore, we need to take measures to ensure that that does not happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to you, Shasni. Mute yourself, please. Mute, yeah. Yeah.
I think after the scenario that Professor Kondapalli and of course Ambassador Shamsaran have put out from what the party Congress means, I think more than ever India has to look at the China challenge rather than any other definition of the relationship from all spheres. The first is, of course, the bilateral one, including the military standoff at the line of actual control that will hit 3 years in April. The maritime sphere, where we're increasingly seeing the Chinese Navy making its presence felt. India's position as the net regional security provider in the Indian Ocean region is obviously very important to us. And the question will have to be: is there going to be some kind of way of dealing with China on the maritime sphere, or is that something that we can't even get to until we have dealt with our own bilateral military issues with them? The third area is, of course, India's own neighborhood. And while there have been other concerns in the past, for example, China overtaking India when it comes to trade with all India's SAARC neighbors, when it comes to investment in all the South Asian countries, when it comes to tourism, which of course is pre-COVID, when it came to students from each of these countries. Over the last few years, if you look at 2008 and if you look at 2019 or 2018, you will see that the balance of power has shifted towards China on all of those issues. More than that, now we have to look at what China's investments in BRI in the region mean, as well as China's strategic presence. And the whole thing that played out with Sri Lanka, a country where India had really gone out of its way at a time when it was really in trouble, was still not able to throw off the Chinese pressure to allow its ship to come in. I think that's a small example of the kind of challenge India is up against. Finally, and we didn't have time to speak about this, China's moves to kind of constrain India on the multilateral sphere at a time when China has taken over, if you like, leadership of many of these multilateral organizations, and particularly, of course, the UN Security Council, where we face so much pushback on terror designations. That's another place where India is going to have to face the China challenge. I don't think, like in the past, where we saw Prime Minister Modi, President Xi meet 18 times, that we have the luxury anymore of thinking that the leadership level summits can somehow push through and create spaces for talks. I think this is going to be a very long and very hard trudge ahead.
Okay. Now, Shyam, do you want to add anything? Another 2 minutes?
Yeah, so one, with regard to why did Galwan happen, or before that, why Doklam happened. We have had for 40 years a kind of a framework within which whenever issues that are controversial have arisen at the border, both sides have had a stake in trying to resolve them or manage them at least. So all the confidence building measures and the maintenance of peace and tranquility in the border, they actually worked for about 40 years. Why did they not work when something like Doklam happened or something like Galwan happened, where earlier perhaps they could have been at least managed? Precisely because of what I have kept on saying, that the power gap between the two sides has become wider and wider. So whereas earlier the Chinese was tolerant enough with such incidents to say, okay, there is a difference, let us try to resolve it. Now the attitude is these people need to be taught a lesson when such incidents occur. So mindset has changed with regard to dealing with these kind of issues. And I doubt whether going forward, this mindset is going to change unless, as I said, the power gap actually starts shrinking again. Yeah. The second point is only to endorse what Suhasini said about the importance of our neighborhood policy. Because at the end of the day, the most important theater where this rivalry is going to play out, in a sense, is really the neighborhood. And I think we have made some sort of advances in the recent past, taking advantage of some missteps by the Chinese. But I think we need to do much more. Reason why I'm saying this is that perhaps there may be a sense that we have become very big player on the global stage. We are going to be chairing the SCO, we are going to be chairing the G20, all the attention is going to be focused on that. And I suspect that this may lead to a further neglect of the neighborhood. And I think we should perhaps realize that our ability to play a more influential role at G20 or at SCO is in fact based on how successful we are, how good we are at managing at our own periphery. Thanks.
Thank you. Before we close, I would like to invite some very senior friends who are on the audience side. Padmavya sir, would you like to say something? Comment. A lot of neighborhood has been mentioned many times. You are Home Secretary. You want to say something? No? Okay. I see the director of Gateway of India, not Gateway, Gateway House. Now, she has been traveling in the car. I was saying she was listening to the program in the car. Now she has reached home and she's at home. Neelam, do you want to say something? Neelam. Unmute yourself. Unmute.
Yeah,
Yes.
Thank you, Surendra. No, I actually don't have anything to add, partly because I missed a lot of the earlier part of the discussion. The only thing I would like to add to what Ambassador Shamsaran has said, and someone else may have said it already, is that it's not only Japan which has such deep equities. There is a big debate on in Germany with so many corporations whose 30-40% of profit comes from China. And in the recent visit by Scholz, a big commercial delegation accompanied him. So if there is deglobalization happening, it's very small and it's only in small spurts.
Okay. I had asked Ashley Tallis when he came up program. Recently, former Ambassador Romer, I say Americans have been talking and asking American firms to pull out from China. How many of them have done it? There's a very few. And there's a Prasant Jha written in Hindustan Times yesterday. There's a huge lobby of corporate sector in the US, which pressing Republicans that they must really have expansive relations with China, not really shrinking, though they have problem with China. Last but Sanjay, you have been listening very patiently, former Secretary East. You have the last word. Unmute yourself and say something.
I've listened to the discussion with great interest. I have nothing further to add. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you all. You have been all very kind to share. It has been one of very productive and candid discussion. I think a lot of substance. I wish we had more people, but as I mentioned, with the fever of FIFA and fever of elections and all kinds of distractions, not many people have logged in. But I thank each one of you, Shyam, General Kapoor, Suhasini, Professor Kondapalli, and all the people who have logged in. Thank you very much. And see you soon again. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.